This is our first in-person and online event of the year. And hopefully going forward, all of our events will be live streamed and in person. We're so excited to kick off this first event with our colleagues in Black Studies Department who are part of the Black Studies Colloquium, and this very special iteration, Black Life's Future. And I would like to kick us off by introducing Professor Erica Richardson in the English department. Thank you all so much for being here. Please use the chat, and hopefully this will be a very lively discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, my name is Erica Richardson. I'm a professor in the English department and part of the Black Studies Colloquium. I am here today with two of my wonderful colleagues, Rojo Robles and Tshombe Miles, both in Black and Latino Studies. And today we are talking about racial capitalism, radical Black feminism, and imagining the archive in Quilombo. So before we get started, I want to thank everyone that has made this event possible, especially the Black and Latino Studies Department and a Provost Faculty Innovation Grant, as well as the Mishkin Gallery for hosting us in this wonderful space. We're so happy to be here in person, but also continue to share this with you all at home. So as Elena mentioned, this is one of our first events in the Black Life Futures series. This is a research program that involves faculty and students creating creative inquiry, considering ideas about Black ecologies and African diaspora. So this smaller program is part of the larger Black Studies Colloquium. We have programming throughout the year dedicated to fostering research for faculty and students, dedicated to the production of knowledge for Black studies. And just for you to put on your calendars, on March 16th at 6 p.m., we will have another conversation with our wonderful Professor Rojo Robles and Pedro Lebrón Ortiz. So please keep that in your calendars and keep that in mind moving forward. So we have a lot of topics for today. We have a lot of thoughts about this film. This film is offered through Baruch's library. Anyone with Baruch ID, any sort of access, can get the film through that. It's streaming. And our topics today are going to include speculation and imagining the Maroon archive, Maroon Mlogics, Black geographies, Maroon landscapes and ecosystems, racial capitalism, and then hopefully getting to some music in the film, which we've already had a little preliminary jam session about, sharing Spotify playlists. Maybe we'll continue to share it throughout the evening. So to begin with, thinking about Quilombo as a film that imagines an archive, I wanted to bring up some ideas offered by Saidiya Hartman in our text, Venus in Two Acts. How can narrative embody life in words and at the same time respect what we cannot know? How does one listen for the groans and cries, the undecipherable songs, the crackle of fire in the cane fields, the laments of the dead, and the shouts of victory, and then assign words to all of it? Is it possible to construct a story from the locus of impossible speech or resurrect lives from the ruins? Can beauty provide an antidote to dishonor, and love a way to exhume very cries and reanimate the dead? Bearing this in mind, when I was watching Quilombo, especially the beginning, and we're going to show a little clip of it as well to start out our conversation, I noticed how silent the figures were, especially the Black female figures. And for me, to some extent, that spoke to the realities of the archive and the realities of that social history. When does a Black woman get to have a voice, let alone a Black woman who is a slave? At the same time, seeing it on the screen was a beautiful opportunity to consider what silence can embody, what protest it can do, what it can imagine, what it can yield. And so from the beginning, this is how I'm thinking about, bringing that narrative or embodying life with the archive and what Quilombo can accomplish and make possible for us. And this is just like the continuation of the quotation. I'm not going to read it at length because I want to get to the place of talking about the ideas shared by my colleagues and I, and also looking closer at the film. So I want to pose some questions for us. How can Marinage help us speculate about thriving Afro-descendants cultures in the Americas? How do we enter the archive silent with death, with loss, yet burgeoning with thoughts, feelings, and voices that we will never hear? So we were talking about it a little bit earlier, but yeah, like let's get into it even more. Yeah, how do we speculate, or what does Quilombo help us speculate and think about with such a rich archive as the Maroons in Brazil?
Well, for one, this film is a part of Brazilian folklore. It's something that has been talked about since it happened. So it's in the memory of the Brazilian people. And you can see, like, when some of the first histories are done about it, some of the first histories about Brazil, you see a discussion about Palmeiras. And so it really, this is a really major moment in history in Brazil. And so I think that it really is going to work as a kind of alternative history as well, because although it's talked about in conversation and it's something remembered, it only really becomes powerful and part of the official history really in the 1980s in Brazil. And so that goes to show you these different forces at work, right? On the one hand, you have that memory is strong and powerful, but then on the other hand, it's something that you want to forget. So it's very powerful.
I think also that the film it's participating from a very complex and rich cultural movement in Brazil, and I would say like all over the world, the movement of the new waves, right, in cinema. Of course, the famous one is the French New Wave, but in Brazil there was a new wave as well. It was called Cinema Novo. Cinema Novo, and hopefully we will have a time to watch a little clip that kind of like summarizes the movement at the end, but just to summarize, it was a movement that originated in the 60s when filmmakers decided, influenced by neorealism and other film movements that were like taking to the streets, taking the cameras to the street. They decided also to portray the reality of Brazilian society. And part of that was going to the cities, part of that was like filming in the street, but also part of that was like recovering history, the history of marginalized communities in Brazil. And definitely the Afro-descendants were participating in that. And this particular filmmaker, Carlos Diegues, he did, in the early 60s, a film on Ganga Zumba. So this is a continuation of his work, right? And part of Cinema Novo's goal was precisely to speculate about the silences in history, to kind of like create a new discourse about the national identity in Brazil, and incorporating the African voices and the indigenous voices and the women's voices as well as part of that discourse on national identity.
I was really putting together two different things hearing y'all speak, especially the bit about how the 1980s was the time period that this history is really being more formally recognized. It's like also our film comes out in 1984, and then add to that, this new style, this especially the neo, the surrealism. That there's going to be a fun moment where like there's lots of fire, and I feel like there's a moment of like magical realism that we'll probably touch on a little bit. But all these elements together, it's like the film kind of captures different discourses intersecting, but also, much like you both have been saying, making things possible by returning to the archive and seeing it anew. It's like doing justice to the past, but also like that's always going to be a commentary. And okay.
Just one more point is that so the 1980s is representing an opening politically and culturally in Brazil because it had been under a dictatorship. from the 60s to the 80s. And so that's another aspect where a film like this could actually be produced without, it being censored. So it's a really important moment as well. And then in 1988, there's this rediscovery of discussions about slavery and racism in 1988, which marks the 100 years of the ending of slavery, the celebration of the forming of slavery. And of course, the Black movement is going to use that as a moment to critique that, what they would say, that slavery had not really ended. So those are some things to think about, like when this film is coming out.
One important thing is also to think about music and songwriting, and the fact that we have a major composer here, Gilberto Gil, a member of the Tropicalia movement, also from the 60s, but also had to, many of them had to get out of the country to be saved, but in the 80s they were able to return. Caetano Veloso is also part of that movement, and other musicians, Sultantes and others, but many of them were in contact with cosmopolitan cultures when they were in exile. So they brought a lot of influences and interactions with discourses on race, discourses on sovereignty, and Gilberto Gil was inserting that, and inserting a Black power discourse in the 80s, but also incorporating the aesthetics of Tropicalia that were really bright, very colorful, also very psychedelic in many ways. Although of course the 80s carries other elements, right? We were talking about a little bit of reggae there, so we have an interconnection of Black movement and international Black movements that were incorporated by Gilberto Gil as well.
And so now I'm gonna share a clip from the film that'll really sort of further illustrate these conversations that we've started.
Pode-se torcer a peça até sangrar pela boca, apertando-se o anel referente ao aparelho digestivo. Deste modo, o escravo sofrerá o castigo que merecer, sem prejuízo de sua vida, ou mesmo de sua capacidade de trabalho, estando assim protegida a propriedade de seu senhor.
Senhor?
Que foi? Ele morreu? Ele não podia ter feito isto comigo.
Dona Olímpia! Dona Olímpia, o senhor, seu marido, mandou avisar que chegou a Santa Rita um oficial holandês. E é pra senhora arrumar a casa.
Os holandeses aqui em Santa Rita? Na minha casa? Andrezinho, onde você vai?
Sua mãe tá lhe chamando.
Ah, eu quero ver a cara desses holandeses. Vamos!
André! Gongoba, vai atrás dele, Gongoba.
Andrezinho. André. Andrezinho. André.
Você tá maluco? Ele tava matando o Sr. Oroba. E eu não ia deixar ele matar o Sr. Oroba de tanta pancada.
Você é novo aqui. Você acabou de chegar em Santa Rita. Você não imagina o quanto vai sofrer pelo que fez.
A gente podia fugir.
Fugir pra onde?
Eu quero morrer. Eu prefiro morrer. Eu vou pra...
Não, Sr. Oroba. Morrer, não.
Tá vindo gente! Tá vindo gente!
Se a gente se juntasse.
Eu estou precisando de mais escravos aqui em Santa Rita. Se o senhor quisesse me vender os seus prisioneiros...
Não posso. Eles pertencem ao governador, que foi quem financiou a nossa expedição a Palmares.
Dandara, aguardente. Com quantos homens o senhor subiu a serra?
Bem,
200, 300?
mais ou menos.
Mas, capitão, que fracasso fantástico, hein?
Pai! Aqui devia ter uns negros trabalhando.
Dandara, chama os feitores, depressa.
Não podem fazer isso comigo, eu sou autoridade.
Dandara, minha espada!
And I feel like I have so many things I like to say about the scene. So I'm going to be quiet at first and give my colleagues an opportunity to say some of their thoughts about this particular moment, or at least the beginning of the film. I can totally go for it if you want. Well, I'm
super ready, so go
yeah,
for it.
I am super ready. So the reason I love this moment is because going back to what I was saying about the figures bearing witness, but their witnessing is now embodied and now carries this kind of material and physical expression and meaning within the film, especially with Ndada. At first, her name becomes a call of servitude, but then it's a call to rise up. You know, when the master calls her name, it's to bring the water, to perform the service, to do the labor, to embody the status of being a slave. But then when her partner calls to her and there's the uprising, it's now my name is a call to action. Now my name is a call, you know, to push back against the oppressor, the most like violent and apparent and clear way possible. Like, bring me my sword. She got it. She got your sword. And you gave it to her. I also think about this moment as, in terms of the landscape, you can't see anything but the grass itself. You can't see beyond everything that's grown up. And this is the same land that they're laboring in. But when they cut across it, when they no longer take a path that's been pre-established, when they start to move through it, no longer working, but using it as a refuge for themselves, it becomes a way for them to interrupt that slave economy and that colonial process by literally coming in from the sides, from the land, that they once worked. So this is why I want to show this first thing, because that's what I end up thinking about. But I welcome your responses as well. I imagine there are other movements in the film that also kind of just like gripped you as well.
Yeah, I think like it's a moment also like that allowed us to think about the unthinkable, right? In the official history, right? And how the history of slavery also usually portrays the enslaved people as passive, submissive people. And suddenly we see here, like actually the film started right away with Black rebellion and with the rejection to colonialism and to the colonial authorities and to a radical rejection to colonialism and to slavery. And I feel like that is very important, how the film started with that.
Right. So from the historical perspective, what I find interesting is that they set up this dialogue between the Portuguese and Dutch, right? They're having a war, right? And in this war is an opportunity for the slaves to run away, to seek revenge on their masters. And this is a common trope in the history. Because in many ways, what makes the Haitian Revolution possible is what's going on in France, right? They're battling each other, and then the slaves see this as an opportunity to revolt and to overthrow their masters. And this is really allows Americans an opportunity to prosper and grow because it's through that conflict between the Dutch and the Portuguese that's going to allow so many people to run away. Whereas you're going to have this huge runaway community that's going to grow, which had already existed prior to this war, right? And now it's going to be a formidable force with the confusion between those colonial powers, the Dutch and Portuguese in this case. Yeah.
What I love about what you just said, Tshombe, is this idea, or not this idea, the fact of the political and historical agencies of slaves. Like, when in that moment of conflict, that is the opportunity, and it's not missed. It's actually thoroughly recognized and used. And I think that's something that we often sort of dismiss, especially when we're seeing these records and like there's an absence of names sometimes. But also, I think the way we're taught history is that slaves and Black people don't have a history. They don't have this agency. They're constantly just trying to, get outside of oppression. But that's not a position of like victimhood. That's also a position of agency. And I think recognizing that, and that's actually, there's a fugitive component to that. This sense of what the Europeans' powers could not recognize is the very thing that allows them to make this movement, to make this shift, and to have that sort of radical moment of uprising. I also just wanted to, and I kind of wanted to bring this up as a question I wanted to play around with you and just think more about. Seeing Dendara like stab this guy, and then also seeing other women take up these kind of political social advisor positions, like really sort of being a part of these different moments of how do we rebel, how do we create our community. And for me, I wonder, or at least from my position studying primarily from the humanities and literature, I wonder like to what extent is this imagined, and to what extent is it actually like a part of the history? And if it's primarily imagined, like why is it that we look to the in order to see a different political horizon. So yeah, like that was the thing I've been wondering about. And we're gonna have another clip with another figure of a white woman, but also having this kind of political agency that is paramount. And I'm wondering, why are we drawn to these particular moments, or what do these moments do for us, especially within the film, but also in other spaces?
I'm thinking of also the international movement of negritude, and how the negritude movement in the 20th century from the 30s onwards also like was looking back to Africa, right? And they were like intentionally trying to unveil African history, and part of African history is understanding also the leadership of women, right? And how like this is reimagining the Maroon Wars and reimagining the origins of Palmares. And if you think of it through the perspective of negritude and movements like that are looking back to Africa, a part of their job that they're doing is also like recuperating that type of leadership that that was common in Africa as well, right? And understanding leadership not from a patriarchal point of view, although of course like the protagonists of this film are males for the most part, but the presence of Landara from the beginning is really essential and key. And I feel like it's part of that that looking back to Africa that negritude proposed, and also like many Brazilian people and many Brazilian groups were influenced, by the proposals of negritude and the proposal of Pan-Africanism in the Caribbean and also in the United States. And we're understanding their history also through the perspective of the 20th century as well. And the recuperations that artists and historians of the 20th centuries were doing regarding the history of Africa and its connection to the Americas.
Absolutely. It's so useful to think about this as the feminism at stake is part of like negritude in a Pan-African tradition. It makes me like very excited, and also helps me kind of shift some assumptions I may have made, or even just expand my understanding of like what does the African diaspora have to offer. And part of it is like another kind of political orientation that incorporates with it. And again, it's like, it's not perfect. It's not like, it may not speak to sort of all our imaginings in our contemporary moment, but I do think, much like you're saying, the sense of recuperation is critical and like fascinating to recognize as having an African origin.
This is very connected, for example, to the Black Panther film that also incorporates women warriors as, and they're like central to the film, that particular very contemporary film that is also looking back at Africa and reimagining and speculating about thriving Africa, right? So I see like a lot of connection between those two films.
That's our next film night, you guys. Wait for it. Our next screening. I mean, you always watch Black Panther. Another viewing. I'm now going to transition us to thinking about some other concepts, including geographies. And I know, hopefully, I don't have the computer set up in the best way for my colleague, but I know, Rojo, you wanted to talk a little bit about this.
So this is an article that we're reading in my class, Debates in Latin America, and this is called Afro-Latin American Geographies of In-Betweenness, right? And this concept of in-betweenness is very important because it's a discussion about Maroon communities as spaces precisely about in-betweenness. And she uses, Ana Laura Zabalaguillén uses like theory from Latino Studies, for example, the notion of borderlands of Gloria Saidiya, who talks about, right, like the spaces and the states being in between. And she describes, she's particularly interested in the Palenques in Colombia, but again, like Maroon communities, but in the case of Colombia. And she's interested in talking about how, like, for her, and her critique is that for her, it's very important to understand that Palenques or Quilombos were important sites to imagine a life for Afro-descendants in which they were not enslaved in the Americas and in which they hold leadership positions, but at the same time, she says that it's important not to romanticize these spaces and to think about also the negotiations that were put in place in order for these Maroon communities to exist or to be in peace or to turn into official towns, as is in the case of Colombia, right? And for her, what she presents is like, in order for a Maroon community to thrive many times, the case was the Maroons needed to negotiate, legal terms, treaties, with the colonial authorities. And this particular film, Quilombo, is presenting that, right? Like it's presenting how, like, in order to survive or to thrive, they needed to engage in those discussions and in those debates, and not everybody was on the same page regarding that, right? And for many colonial authorities, to propose peace was also to propose co-option, the co-option of the Maroon town. And this is ideas that I feel like are important. And that Quilombo represents really well that debate between negotiation and incorporation into the colonial geographies, or a complete separation, but that will mean war, of course.
Yeah, so we talked about this, right? The Spanish Empire, one of the ways in which they dealt with these Maroon communities was to say, okay, they look like they could really create a big problem for us. So let's negotiate peace with them. So in places like Florida, Mexico, Colombia, throughout the Spanish Empire, the Maroons often have an opportunity to negotiate a peace. But in negotiating that peace, there are things that will be non-revolutionary, so to speak, right? So they're going to be incorporated basically into the Spanish Empire now. That means that when slaves run away, they're going to return those slaves. So that's not exactly revolutionary anymore. And they're basically, as Rojo mentioned, they're going to be segregated in those towns. And in the long term, that has a way in which it kind of marginalizes them. And the revolutionary aspect of it all, is in many ways lost. Though, of course, those individuals, those people will gain a kind of freedom, right? But it's no threat to the larger economy, political economy. Yeah.
I think this is so fascinating and so useful, especially thinking about the nuances of a political economy, because I don't think we always give due justice to that process, especially when we have Black subjects, because then it's like our liberatory politics become like maybe even like extreme ideals where it's like, no, there are practical matters of like, how do you actually become recognized? And this is not to say that we're okay with, some of this movement back towards the very thing we're trying to escape, but I think there's a way in which the harsh critique or the sense of like, how free is it? How much did you claim? Can sometimes like limit our way of understanding the complexity and the nuances of what it means to even be recognized.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, you can't really blame someone. I mean, and also it's a choice of maybe death if they don't, right? So if they say, no, we're going to fight, then they can be exterminated. I mean, which ultimately happens in Palmares, which that Quilombo, so to speak, is exterminated. Though, some of them do escape and form lesser Quilombolas.
So I'm gonna like check in a little bit, even though I know it's like we're all live, like it's a conversation. I know we have some more slides talking about heritage as state of being, and then I think going further into the conversation we've already started about what does it mean to be recognized. I just want to check in with you, Rojo. Would you like to talk a little bit about this before we go into?
Yeah, sure. I'm gonna be brief, right? Because I feel like the film shows this really brightly. literally and symbolically as well, right? So part of the ongoing conversation that we're gonna have is about like Maroon Mlogics, the next events with Pedro Lebrón Ortiz, and Pedro Lebrón Ortiz is also like this person who's thinking about Maroon Mlogics as a philosophical category, right? And something that he says, I'm gonna just read directly from the slide. Freedom can be conceived of as an existential state of being in which one rejects the impositions of rank archetypes by means of an affirmation of one's own world. And I feel like the film, right, by speculating, about these Maroon communities, precisely doing that work of affirming the life of Afro-descendants, but affirming their life not as enslaved people, but actually as cultural producers, or people who are engaged in a regular commercial exchanges. There's scenes in the market, there's scenes in which they're playing a sort of football or something like that, playing sports, building their houses. They're like dancing capoeira, and there's also like engaging in ritual and religious rituals. So we see, right, how the film is interested in portraying that, right? And it's putting a spotlight on all these different African traditions that are not connected to the history of slavery. They're actually connected to the cultural vibrancy of African cultures and to the intermingling of different African groups in the Americas. And I feel like that is very important from the film. That is, yes, it's presenting this war between the Maroons and the Portuguese colonists, but it's also presenting the African cultures in Brazil and how that they were experiencing a cultural exchange with each other.
Absolutely, and I do on this point of a cultural exchange and the vibrancy that emerges. I want to go to a clip that you recommended that really gets us to think about this in relationship to indigeneity. So
that's another important thing also, like for and this is something that Laura Guillén also presents, that Pedro Lebrón Ortiz also presents, this idea that it's important to conceive of Maroon communities as spaces where indigenous people and Black people were working together, and were exchanging in deep cultural integration, right? And this is something also that the film shows, right? There's like this group of indigenous people that joins the Quilombo, right? And it's really beautiful, that moment, and the ways they integrate themselves into the community and participate from a funeral ritual, right? From the celebrations, right? So they're part of the community.
Thank you so much for that. And now we're gonna see a little bit what we're talking about.
Com a peste na aldeia, é melhor você não sair de noite. Francisco. Francisco, você não está me ouvindo? Está muito longe daqui.
Toca tabaquinho, boas, a bomba, e pica. Eles estavam atravessando a serra. Pediram para ver Gangazumba. E para onde eles estão indo?
Pro outro lado da serra, à procura da terra sem males.
E onde fica essa terra sem males?
Não sei. Ninguém sabe. Agora vou continuar caminhando com meu povo, até que apareça o sinal de que chegamos.
Talvez seja esse o sinal, irmão.
So we've talked a lot about sort of the speculation in the film, and we mentioned a little bit this trade, but I also know that based on our last amazing presentation with Professor Tshombe Miles, that people were very curious to know more and more about how we can think about racial capitalism in relationship to this history. And as you say here, the possibility of Maris and the making of alternative worlds. What's going on? Tell us more.
So let's go. So I just wanted to say a few things about Mary's. One of the things that's so appealing, I think, about these Quilombo communities is this subsistent collective farming, right? So, and the idea of leisure time. So, I mean, if you're working on a sugar plantation and someone gives you an opportunity to basically grow your own crops just to survive and, just to live, and have more opportunities to enjoy your life, your family, and so on. And, remember, this is in the 1600s. So that's great. Right? And so this is one of the, something I think really appealing about it. And just a couple more points. This was interesting is that it's a polyandry community. So there is, meaning that there are far more Black men than Black women. And in fact, there's more men in general in the colonial period. So unlike what happens in the 1600s, where the English are bringing their families to what are the 13 colonies, I suppose, are in the Northeast, where they're bringing families. These are basically men coming. And there's some cases where women are gonna come as well, but it's overwhelmingly men. And then there are far more African slaves who are male than women, right? So that, and what that means is in these Quilombos, they're often overwhelmingly male, and they have to actually share women for sexual relations, which that's gotta speak a lot about gender politics, sexuality, and everything going on there, right? And this idea about the archives, right? Another thing is that Rojo just talked about, that these are multi-ethnic communities. So although those overwhelmingly African slaves, it's also, there are these connections about with the indigenous communities. And well, we dealt with the last point, but I think that historically, we talk about the archives and we talk about Hartman and her reimagining that. That's something that we really know very little about. What those kind of relationships were, how were African and indigenous people living together, right? That's something like almost to this day, historians have done very little, anthropologists have done very little work or serious work about that. It's like, because again, it's hard to get to the archival work. I mean, there's not a lot said in archives that we traditionally use, right? So that really is important, I think, when we're thinking about that. But then, just to go to that last point there, Palmares doesn't sign any negotiation with the Portuguese And I think, in large part, the Portuguese were not particularly interested in signing like the Spanish are. They just want to destroy that at Quilombo. So those are just some things to keep in mind, and we just go to this slide. So going back to this idea of racial capitalism, I just want to remind us from the last talk that really when we're talking about, and this is 1600, so it's not really capitalism, it's a kind of, you're still dealing with a kind of feudal system in Europe, and these are, the Spanish and Portuguese are monopolizing the commerce and trade, which becomes an issue for merchants and other elites. You know, so, but this is sort of a precursor to a capitalist system that's happening and is emerging. But that system is based on complete exploitation. It's the enslavement of African people, it's the removal of indigenous people, and also using indigenous people as another labor source. So those indigenous folk are another kind of unfree labor, really, in the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire as well. And in Brazil, indigenous folk are actually slaves by the side of Africans up into the 1700s, right? And then it's only Africans. And so this is, I think, a really, really interesting guy. Abadias do Nascimento, he was born in 1914, he died more recently in 2011. And one of the things that's so important about this guy is that he's one of the really crucial thinkers about reimagining Palmares in particular as a way of thinking about Brazil, what the political economy could look like. And you know what, I don't even really want to show the other slides just for time, but what I'll say is, I'll say a couple of things here. So Abadias do Nascimento, he is, like I said, he's born in 1914. He's really engaged with this idea of what he calls Quilombismo, right? So in the 40s, he produces a newspaper that's called Quilombo, right? He later writes essays and books on expounding on this idea of Quilombismo. And his idea is, and by the way, he's going to return from political exile in the 80s. He's going to become a congressman and a senator. He's going to be affiliated with a major political party, the PDT. And he uses this as an idea to think about really socialism, but from a multicultural perspective, with the idea that in order for that to work, you're going to have to understand our particular history, right? So this is our history, and he's not really conversating with Cedric Robinson, he's not directly talking about racial capitalism. But I think that there are two guys that should have been in dialogue, because what he's talking about is, listen, we have this history of exploitation, and to this day, that same population after slavery is still in a subordinate position. So how do we reimagine and recreate a new community? And so part of what he does when he's in Congress is to talk about what I guess we would call political race theory now. He's doing this back in the 70s, where he's saying we have to talk about our history. We have to talk about the history of expropriating the land of the indigenous folk. We have to talk about the history of slavery because it's relevant to where we are right now. So we have to understand those histories. But at the same time, we have to talk about political economy. He talks about free higher education for all, educational opportunities for all, healthcare, all of the things in which we talk about within a kind of socialistic context. But in conjunction with our own political experience, really, is what he's talking about. And Palmares for him is one of the main inspirations of his politics.
Thank you so much for that. I mean, there's a wonderful way we're working across all these different discourses, but they converge on this moment in history, this moment of action, and the artistic production that helps us engage it again. I think, especially thinking across these, like, it's the thing I was hoping we were talking about from the beginning, like the complexity and the nuance, but also, this movement of political consciousness, artistic representation, and then also even reimagining the way we think about capitalism. Understanding that there's only so far it can go,
right.
But it's like it's all being brought together through this community.
Sorry, one important thing that I forgot is that Amadeus Nascimento was an artist. So he's a playwright, and he has this organization back in the 30s and 40s. It's called Teatro Experimental Negro, which is the Black experimental theater. And it coincides with Getúlio Vargas, who was the president of Brazil. And again, it's to bring forward this voice of the Afro-Brazilian history, which is completely whitewashed. And he grows up saying, like, we're treated as if we have no history, we have no culture, when in fact that the Afro-Brazilians are playing a disproportionate role in shaping the culture of Brazil. But just
yeah, no, I mean, thank you for expanding on that and reminding us, like, what we gain through an artistic discourse, but also, I guess, the interdisciplinarity within all that. It really makes us, like, look to these films as our archives and as a place of play and expansion, and really digging into the things that we may have felt we didn't have access to. So I want to, before we open up to chat or questions from the chat and from the audience, there was a particular scene or segment of the film that all three of us really enjoyed. I think particularly the kind of magical realism that also occurs. And so before we open it up to conversation and ask people, how has this film impacted them, or what kind of surprised them and got them thinking, we want to share a longer clip of a scene where the character of Zumi, who was born free but then kidnapped and then escaped again from slavery as an adult, and his moment of breaking other slaves free as his incorporation into the Quilombo, becoming part of that community. This is followed by a scene where the issue of authority being recognized by European powers occurs. So we see two very different political economies, two very different ways of being recognized as free subjects. And also a lot of fun music along the way. So let's see if, like, third time is the charm for me through this process.
A Zumbi Alakjat. A quem foi dada a coroa da guerra? Tu és zumbi! O que não morre nunca! Taure, zumbi dos palmares! Taure!
Saurê, zumbi dos palmares.
Zumbi, comandante guerreiro, Oguiê, ferreiro, mor capitão da capitania da minha cabeça, mandai alforria pro meu coração. felicidade do negro é uma felicidade guerreira. Do maracatu, do maculele, do moleque bamba. Minha espada espalha sol da guerra. Meu quilombo incandescendo a serra. Dali qual o leque, o sapateado do mestre escola de samba. Tombo de ladeira, rabo de arraia.
Não precisa ter medo.
Mas o que você tem espalhado por aqui ultimamente é só medo.
Et clamor meus ad te veniat.
Dominus vobiscum.
Et cum spiritu tu.
Francisco.
Meu nome não é esse, padre. Eu sou Zumbi dos Palmares. Eu vim lhe devolver isso, padre. Muito obrigado. O cesto de comida, infelizmente, não fui eu que comi.
Mas havia uma outra coisa que você esqueceu de levar.
Não, eu não me esqueci. É que isso não ia me servir para nada. A não ser que eu pegasse pelo outro lado.
Do negro é uma felicidade guerreira. A felicidade do negro é uma felicidade guerreira. Brasil, meu Brasil brasileiro, meu grande terreiro, meu berço e nação, zumbi protetor, guardião, padroeiro, mandai alforria pro meu coração.
Dandara. O Recife, Dandara.
Tome o Recife, Zumbi dos Palmares. Você já chegou até aqui. Agora é fácil entrar no Recife.
Se eu entrar na capital deles, mesmo como vencedor de uma guerra, vou ter que fazer o que eles fazem. Se a gente tomar o Recife, Dandara, vai acabar tendo que ter escravos, como eles.
Eu chamei vocês porque eu recebi uma carta do governador de Pernambuco, em nome do rei de Portugal, pedindo que eu fosse ao Recife discutir a paz. Tá aí. Ana de Ferro leu pra mim.
Isso é uma traição.
De quem?
A paz, o Zumbi está lhe dando com a vitória na guerra, Gangazumba.
A gente precisa dar um tempo sem guerra, Dandara. Que é pra crescer, até ficar impossível destruir Palmares. Eu vou ao Recife. Que é pra saber o que eles querem com a gente.
So I cut the scene a little bit short because I felt as though, especially hearing the music and now knowing sort of the stakes of like what is the middle of the film, the major plot point of what do we do now that we have this certain amount of stability and power? Are we going to be just like them? So I think this is a good point for us to like reflect on some of the conversations we've been having, but also open it up to people in the chat to consider, you know, what surprised you, what did you connect to, and maybe even a little bit about the music, especially given how, I don't know if anyone noticed, but I was like jamming out at some point. Yeah, like quite impressive, but also this kind of slaps. So, it gives us some things that we might want to talk more about. But yeah, so yeah, either thinking about the conversations we've had so far about this moment of authority and recognition or the music, I will hand it over to my fellow panelists to give some of their thoughts while I look into the chat for a moment.
Yeah, I particularly like how important the lyrics are, right? In that scene, right? And how the work of Gilberto Gil is very like centralized in that sequence, right? And it's this idea, I like a couple of ideas from the song, but one of them is like this idea of black joy, the black joy that comes from liberation. Yeah, it's la felicidad guerrera. He sings, and I feel like that's very important. And this idea that taking freedom into my heart, like soon bring freedom into my heart. So it's kind of like a state of being, as we were discussing before, right? And this idea of liberation as a goal that permits enjoyment, that permits freedom, that permits also the communion of the community as well, right? So there's an idea of what comes next, right? It's the future, the black future. We have been talking about black futures, and the song is proposing a black future after the war, right? It's La Felicidad Guerrera is a right to that black future of liberation, right? And I feel like that's very important.
Yeah, I think this idea of like black future sounding, like it's in the music, you can hear it coming, and I don't know, it's like you have to, something about having a kind of material or some sort of sensory connection to like the future you imagine. Sometimes it seems like the initial decisions you made and we're seeing like what's happening in the film. But sometimes it's like in that song that just like helps you see the next day. It takes you where you're going. And like, like it's just like, it's exciting. I can understand why, given the historical context of the moment, like this is the sound that goes with this film.
And speaking of Gilberto Gil, is interesting because he is part of this Tropicalia movement that Rojo was talking about. And there's a debate going on, particularly in the 70s, of some of the older musicians who are playing a kind of samba music, but that's connected to the 70s, and they want to continue that tradition and think that the music from the outside that the youth in the 70s are loving, like soul music, Aretha Franklin, James Brown, they're listening to that in Rio. Yes, in reggae, and particularly because Jill's from Bahia. So in the 70s, late 70s, early 80s, in Pelourinho, there's all these reggae bars that come about, in San Luis too, in Marias and other places. And so these music's coming from that quote unquote outside. Jill is someone who is syntocratic. He likes to bring this together, but he's very aware of this kind of pro-Blackness. He's very interested in the Black movement. And he's also interested in traditional things going on in Brazil. So he's part of the Fuse de Gandhi, which is a blocko during Carnival, which is part of Carnival in Salvador, not in Rio, right? So he's this guy who connects all these things together. So it's really interesting that he was chosen to do this.
He even goes as far as saying that this is the origin of the nation, right? That this is not male Brazil, right? Like what was says about Brazil is like this is where Brazil was born, right? And through these Maroon Wars, that this is our origin, right? So he's also claiming that Brazil is a black nation.
Right.
That is a very radical moment, in his own writing and within the movie as well.
And it's syncretic. That's important.
Yeah.
It's not, there's all these different elements in the Maroon community. Different African speaking people, they have these European influences, then indigenous folk, but creating a black community in a certain sense. So I think that's fascinating.
I want to make sure, is it okay if we bring up the chat on this?
Yeah, I mean, Alex is going to read that.
Oh, and you can read
Sorry.
it out, Alex. Thank you so much.
We have a few questions and comments in the chat. Tonima asks, I was wondering how the historical information was gathered to create the film. Basically, what historical documents were used for this film? Were they first-hand accounts or mostly second-hand accounts?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I really don't know how the director went about getting the exact documentation. At that time, when that film was made, there are many accounts, and there are first-hand accounts, and a lot of this information is gotten from Rojo Robles, who is detailing during the war of what happens, right? So obviously this is coming from the European side. So you read against the grain to get a lot of that information, but a lot of that information is there. And then also there are just oral traditions that have been accounted for generations, right? And people telling their stories through our festivals like Carnival and so forth, telling that story of Zombie. And like I said, that memory has been there in the history for a long. I mean, there's all kinds of, like the first histories all mention Palmeiras. I mean, no one is denying that it exists, but they do it in a way that's pejorative and dismissive, right? So it's only in that period, 1980s, that this is going to be celebrated. This is going to be something good that happens, right? And before it's always like, something wrong with this.
Usually, I don't know how the process of creating the script came about, but I can imagine, because usually the people who work with this type of histories need to read the archives against the grain, right? And find the snippets, right? And find like these very small moments, and this connects a lot with Hartman, right? What she proposes, like you need to go to the archive and not read at face value. You need to find those like small moments and blow them up in order to get an alternative history of the period, right? And that is something like, in particular, the article that we were reading in class, Zavala Guillen talks about like spending a lot of time in the archives and having to dig deeper into all these documents to really find the stories of the Maroons in Colombia, right? And how also she needed, as we were saying, to engage in oral history, with the people in the palenques in Colombia. And I can imagine that a similar process happened here, because usually the people who engage responsibly with the history of Black people in the Americas usually need to do that type of thing. Right?
Absolutely. I feel like I'm learning so much in this moment, especially, and I appreciate being reminded about the oral history as well. I think there's a way in which we privilege text over anything else. And that's something else that film helps us access, this sense of, these are the stories people told. This is the tradition passed down. And this is another way of capturing it in a way that does feel like parallel to that oral tradition. So I think that was such a good question, and something for us to keep in mind. The archive isn't just what's there; it's what we imagine it to be, and it's also the ways we engage it.
And the silences, as you were saying, let's also investigate the silences, right? As Hartman also proposes, right? It's like we need to look at the silences. Where are the silences and why, right? And how can we speculate on those silences with the minimal things that we have around those silences?
And when that silence leads to that music, it gets popping.
Yeah.
I know there might have been another question or comment in the chat.
Yeah, we have a few comments. So Pablo shares, growing up in Brazil, I remember being impacted as a kid by the rejection of the cross. Unless Tshombe could hold it as a sword and help liberate his people from church-sponsored slavery. Thank you for the illuminating discussion. Jacqueline shares, it was great to watch indices shown how the Palmares community was so resolute in their affirmation of their humanity, not only through their song, but even the sense of pride in which they presented themselves and their ideas on who they are and what they represent. And then we have a future film screening suggestion from Elliot. Dr. Gama, 2021, about the life of the African Brazilian abolitionist, lawyer, and scholar Luis Gama, who died in 1882, 6 years before the end of slavery in Brazil.
These are awesome comments.
And I'd like to make another comment, because there's the other side of this too. For example, in the film, you see when they're trying to capture Palmares, there are Afro-Brazilians there as well. And that's very truthful and faithful to the history. And you often wonder, how are they thinking about this? What's going on in their heads? Because you have two things going on, particularly at that period. Again, the Dutch War is really important, and there's a Black regiment that's led by a guy by the name of Henrique Dias. And he is celebrated by the Portuguese government. He's giving a title, an honor, and he's someone who is part of the official history. And you have those who are part of the Black regiments, and they're segregated, by the way, right? And you have the Negro, you have the Pardo, those are mixed blood, and they're segregated in these units, and then indigenous folk during the colonial period who are fighting on behalf of the Portuguese. And then also we have the slave catchers, who are some of the best slave catchers are actually Afro-Brazilians, or Afro-descendant Brazilians, which is interesting as well. But of course, these people are again surviving, trying to figure out how they can for social mobility and make their way to freedom, or a different way of freedom, a freedom that isn't part of those social hierarchies. And they figure out how they can maneuver in that, right? And so for me, it speaks to the reality of how our societies often work now. And I think that's something to think about, how people often work within a system that is oppressive, and those who are sort of outside of that system, looking for a radical change, right? And then it made me think of what, and I told you guys about this before, what Dandara is like, let's just go into Recife and attack. And he's like, no, we can't do that. But in many ways, I'm very sympathetic to that. Because, this is what's going to happen in the Haitian Revolution. They do that. And they have a certain success. But, and ultimately that Quilombo will be extinguished. So It doesn't, so it's been a lot of complicated decisions there,
And this is also, this book warrants our returns to the archives, our research, our engagement, because it's not just one narrative. And it's not just one trajectory. I think, there's a spectrum of what I think of as fugitivity and radicalism. How far outside do you want to go? And there's always consequences for that.
Right. Exactly.
And I think to recognize them as part of the decision making and the political and social subjectivity of these people is important. It's not like this is the clear cut choice. It's like there are a lot of choices to be made. And then there's of course a lot of different narratives to then follow up because of those choices, which is what makes this film and the work we're respectively doing and engaging with so much important. I think we are right at the end of our time. Is there anything else?
Any other announcements for the Black Studies Colloquium or your department or the Black Life Futures?
We will have an upcoming event on March 16th. This will be on Zoom, and it's going to be a conversation that will be moderated by our wonderful Robles.
It's with Pedro Lebrón Ortiz, who we read just like a little excerpt from his essay, Maroon Mlogics, but his work is about thinking about Maroon from a philosophical point of view, and also thinking about how a community organizing in the Caribbean, in particular in Puerto Rico, in the last couple of years, especially after the hurricane, has continued the tradition of cimarronaje, right? And how they have created autonomous community because of the neglect of the government, of the federal and local government. So we will be engaging with that work and those ideas.
Yes, get high. It's going to be awesome. We look forward to seeing you all then. And until then, thank you so much for joining us and have a good evening.